Now, following on from my previous episode on religion, one of the best insights we can garner into Greek religion archaeologically is by looking at the physical manifestation of its temple sites, namely its sanctuaries. The first kind of sanctuary, and perhaps the largely most popular and well-known one in the modern day, are civic sanctuaries. The type site, of course, being the Athenian Acropolis. Many Greek city-states would have had something along similar lines as the Acropolis in Athens, but usually not as monumental or developed. The Athenian Acropolis is not just a temple site to Athena. It's a monument to Athenian imperialism, signalling the wealth and sophistication of the polis to the outside world. Usually, these civic sanctuaries will be highly nationalistic in nature, related to the direct community, their local deity, or their hero. This nationalistic tone makes sense when you consider that many civic sanctuaries would have been community building projects, likely involving people from all aspects of society and giving something of their own to the temple complex. In this way, as much as this religious complex is about the community relationship with divinity, it's also a way in which the interior members can define themselves as a group against outsiders. One notable exception to this is the Graeco-Egyptian site of Naukratis. This site was a city and Greek trading post in Egypt, located on the Canopic branch of the Nile, southeast of Alexandria. It was the first, and for much of its early history, the only permanent Greek settlement in Egypt, serving as a symbiotic nexus for the interchange of Greek and Egyptian art and culture. While we have evidence of Greco-Egyptian interaction as far back as the Minoan period, it remained purely economic until the 7th century, where Herodotus relates the story of Ionian and Carinian pirates being forced by a storm to land near the Nile Delta, eventually entering the service of the 26th dynasty pharaoh Psamtik I. As Greek settlers arrived in Naukratis, they were allowed to situate themselves, and began the process of colonization. In an effort to create something that they could identify themselves with, some of the earliest constructions at Naukratis are temples. Following excavations by Petri and a few others, we have evidence of temples to Apollo, Hera, the Dioscuri, and Aphrodite. According to Herodotus, however, there was also a sacred building known as the Helleneion. Remarkably, the votives inside the Helleneion come from all over the Aegean, most commonly the eastern Aegean. Interestingly though, a large portion of the inscribed ostraca there, and the pottery, are dedicated to, quote, the gods of the Hellenes and all Greeks. This is a pretty remarkable project. It's projecting an idea of unified identity in a foreign nation. Naukratis is one of the first and only temples seemingly open to all Greeks, regardless of city-states or allegiances. This gives us insight into just how different the Naukratian Greeks were and the particular challenges they may have faced in establishing themselves abroad. They clearly feel a need to project a Panhellenic identity. One can't help wonder how new radical political identifications are rippled back into mainland Greece and help to foster notions of Panhellenism like we see in Homer. These places that are on the fringes of the Greek world are inherently counter-normative, and they often end up feeding back into the more conservative elements of Greek society and disrupting the standard ways of thinking. The other major type of sanctuary that we often see are what we can tentatively call the extra-urban sanctuary. These religious sites are seldom near a city, but they will often be administered by one. A great example of this type of sanctuary is Perachora, a kind of harbour sanctuary located on a promontory on the Corinthian Gulf. This strategic position historically connected the Attic regions with the Peloponnese, meaning that its east and west entrances were the only viable ways in or out of the region by sea. This sanctuary appears to have been controlled primarily by Corinth, although they also seem to have minimized the public portrayal of this control, allowing relatively free movement through the area. In a way, they seem to have stressed the political neutrality brought about by religious spaces here, acting as a wayfare position for travellers and traders. Unsurprisingly, we have a wide assemblage of votive offerings here, primarily brought by sailors and merchants. Items from all over the Eastern Mediterranean, such as Phoenician scarabs, Mesopotamian ivories, Italian metalwork, and personal affects, are all frequently found as offerings to sea deities, usually to ensure protection during travel. We actually see a similar situation in Samos, with the famous temple of Hera there, known as the Samos Heraion. Now, geographically, Samos is another one of those interesting in-between places. It's situated between the Aegean Islands and Anatolia, and yet it's vastly rich in resources. It became a primary gateway for people coming into Greece from Mesopotamia and Anatolia, bringing not only material culture with them, but also ideological culture in the form of cults, mysteries, and religious ideas. Like Perachora, the Heraion was administered by the polis at Samos, but again, not publicly or markedly. As an in-between ritual sanctuary, they allowed relatively free movement and cultural exchange. Archaeologically, this is incredibly clear to us, as the site is chock full of Anatolian and Mesopotamian ivories, bronze work of Egyptian, Ugaritic, Cypriot, and Assyrian origin, and even prestige items like cauldrons and statuettes, and even crocodile and antelope bones, and model ships. We can really think of Samos as a major point of contact between the Ionian polis and the Anatolian kingdoms, both materially and ideologically, something that extends all the way back into the early Bronze Age 2,000 years before. While we often think of votive deposits as instrumental to religious practice, archaeologically, we can reveal some interesting caveats with this. A lot of work has been done on tracing the typology and provenance of votive offerings at sanctuary sites, and what that can tell us about Greek ideology and history. Interestingly, votive deposits actually don't seem to have been very popular until we get into the 8th and 7th century BC. This seems to coincide with a diminishing of importance in the sphere of burial from the 8th century onwards. What this can tell us is that around the time of the public sanctuaries arising, there was also an ideological shift in Greek religion away from burial and the dead. A sphere, of course, where it is much easier to show your own power and prestige, towards votives in temples and more personal ornamentation. Rather than relying on tombs or burial circumstances, the markers of societal differentiation shift to votive deposits instead. This change also reflects and arguably anticipates the polis and civic sanctuary, in which religious expression is becoming more public, communal, and monumental. In other words, the act of offering prestige objects is itself an act of displaying status in front of a larger audience and community, one which marks a shift away from depositing such material in graves or cemeteries towards public locations. All of this is reflecting wider societal, political, and economic changes in the Greek world, especially related to social organisation. Religious sanctuaries took on an inherently political role as a means of marking territory of a polis, all the while reflecting wider cultural and economic roles as meeting points for state discussions. At the same time, we also should distinguish the Panhellenic sanctuaries from the local ones, primarily Olympia and Delphi. Now, Olympia is of course fairly well known as a site, but there are still some questions around it. It's worth pointing out that both Olympia and Delphi are really in the middle of nowhere. They're not near any major polis centre. From an economic and practical point of view, this is strange. While there were local polises around Olympia, none of them ever really became big players in the city-state scene. This also does partially work to its advantage though, as it's precisely for the reason that there is no big interest player administering the site of Olympia that it became so popular. The site was an enormous open field in which no single city-state felt threatened by any other. Olympia's distance from the rest of the civilized world equally contributed to its sense of remoteness and sacredness, and it lessened the political and mundane baggage that often weighed down the civic and extra-urban sanctuaries. A lot of work is being done on understanding the chronology of Olympia, especially with tracing how far back into history it goes as a sacred site. we have enough evidence to suggest that it was considered important at least during the Bronze Age, and especially during the early Iron Age. While it's famous today for the Olympic Games, it was likely a cult site to Zeus first, with the dedication list of Olympia containing the first winners of the Games dating only to 776 BC. Unfortunately, the majority of archaeology can only be dated to about 700 BC onwards. While we know things were going on there prior to this, they just don't leave good remains as evidence, so connecting the earlier phases of cultic activity to the later ones is difficult. The majority of votives left at Panhellenic sites come from aristocratic families, usually in an effort to bolster their own standing and position in the local polis. While civic aspects are present, a lot of the aristocratic nobles are keen to identify themselves as the direct offerer, all of course in an effort to show off not just to the gods, but also to other polises and other families within their own polis. The Sanctuary of Delphi, though, is a little bit different to Olympia, and we have different questions around it. Architecturally, the place is a marvel. It's built into and above a mountain range and was clearly designed to elicit a phenomenological sense of awe as you walk through the temple system. Interestingly though, on your way up to the Temple of Apollo to consult the oracle, you would have had to have gone through two treasuries, that of the Sipnians and the Athenians. These treasuries were governmental buildings, in which not only the polis stored its wealth, but also their votives, usually ones dedicated to Apollo. Naturally, as you are walking through these buildings, it's a chance for the polises to compete with each other and show off their respective wealth and power. This is embodied not only in the votives and the material wealth in there, but also in things like the masonry quality of the buildings themselves, testifying to the superior artistry and cultural traditions, something that Athens is clearly very interested in dominating, and to a certain extent succeeds at doing. A lot of the statuary at Delphi is Athenian in nature. It's very clearly made by Athenian sculptures in that style, especially famous ones like the Delphi Charioteer, which has the added bonus of associating Athens with Delphi in the public mind. If you're walking through a procession and you're seeing styles that are clearly from Athens, you're going to think that Athens owns the place, or at least they have a political stake in it, which is exactly what they want you to think. In total then, we can think of sanctuaries as embodying marginality, being these kind of interspace regions that embody liminality. Rather than divorcing them from wider society, it pays to be aware of their large-scale political, social, and economic roles as a mechanism for the creation of elite power and democratization. Nevertheless, they were instrumental in the development of ideals of Greekness, Panhellenism, and national identity. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.